Welcome to the channel Untold Slave Stories. Today's story uncovers one of the boldest and most ignored acts of resistance in American history. This is the story of a man who needed $800 to buy his family's freedom and chose to steal a Confederate warship, becoming the first black captain in U.S. history. This is a gripping and powerful account. So take a moment, slow your breath and listen closely. Before we start, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments which city and country you're watching from. Your support helps make sure these stories are remembered and not erased. Let's begin. At 4:15 in the morning on May 13, 1862, a Confederate warship moved toward the most heavily guarded military position in the American South. Fort Sumter stood like a dark giant in the center of Charleston Harbor, its thick walls lined with cannons that could destroy any ship in seconds. The guards on watch saw the vessel approach as its steam whistle cut through the early morning silence with a familiar sound. Two long blasts, one short, the signal that meant the ship was friendly. The guards relaxed. They recognized the outline of the CSS Planter, the dispatch boat used by General Roswell Ripley to move weapons and supplies. They saw the figure of the captain standing in the pilot house, arms crossed in his usual stance, wearing his well-known straw hat. Everything seemed normal. Everything felt routine. The guards waved the ship through without hesitation. They had no idea the man in the straw hat was not Captain Charles Relia. They had no idea the man guiding the ship was a 23-year-old enslaved man named Robert Smalls. And they had no idea that within 1 hour, that enslaved man would hand over the Confederate ship, its weapons, and 16 black men, women, and children to the Union Navy. This is the story of the most daring escape in the history of American slavery. This is the story of a man who rose from property to captain, from enslaved to congressman, from being owned to owning the very house where he had once been held in chains. This is the story of Robert Smalls. To understand what Robert Smalls did that morning in 1862, you must first understand where he came from. You have to go back 23 years to a small cabin behind a plantation home in Beaufort, South Carolina. That is where Robert Smalls was born on April 5, 1839. His mother's name was Lydia Polite. She was enslaved and owned by a wealthy planter named Henry McKee. Robert's father was never officially named, but many historians believe it was Henry McKee himself. This was not unusual in the antebellum South. Slaveholders often fathered children with enslaved women. Those children were born into slavery just like their mothers, treated as property like any other item on the plantation. Bert grew up in that small cabin, playing in the dirt yard, seeing the world through the eyes of a child who did not yet fully understand the horror of his life. Lydia worked inside the McKee household rather than in the fields. This was considered a favored position among enslaved people. House slaves usually had better food, better clothes, and were spared the brutal labor of planting and harvesting. But Lydia was afraid her son would grow up soft. She feared Robert would become too comfortable in the big house and forget what slavery truly was. She had seen it before. Had seen house slaves look down on field slaves, believing they were better because they lived closer to the master. Lydia did not want that for her son. She wanted Robert to know the truth. She wanted him to understand what it really meant to be owned. So she did something that may seem cruel, but it shaped Robert Smalls for the rest of his life. She made him watch. Lydia took young Robert to see the whippings. She forced him to stand there, a small boy with wide eyes, as overseers tied enslaved men and women to posts and beat them with leather straps until their backs were raw and bleeding. She made him hear the screams. She made him see the blood soaking into the ground. She wanted him to understand that this was slavery, not the comfort of the big house, not second-hand clothes from the master's children. This was slavery, the whip, the blood, the total power of one human being over another. Robert never forgot those scenes. They burned into his mind forever, and as he grew older, something inside him began to change. The quiet boy who once played near the big house slowly became someone else. He grew defiant. By his teenage years, Robert had a reputation for being difficult. He talked back. He questioned orders. He refused to quietly accept his place. The overseers did not know what to do with him. He was too valuable to sell, especially if Henry McKee was truly his father, but he was too rebellious to control. He was even jailed for his behavior, punished simply for refusing to submit. Eventually, the McKee family decided something had to change. They could not allow a defiant enslaved boy to influence others or threaten the strict order of the plantation. So in 1851, when Robert was only 12 years old, they sent him away to Charleston. Charleston in 1851 was one of the most important cities in the South. It was a center of trade, culture, and slavery. Over 150,000 enslaved Africans had passed through its port during the transatlantic slave trade. The city's wealth depended on black labor, and its docks were constantly busy with the business of human bondage. The Mexicans hired Robert out to work in the city, a common practice at the time. Slaveholders rented enslaved people to businesses and kept the wages for themselves. Robert received nothing but food and a place to sleep. UT for Robert Smalls, Charleston was not a punishment, it was a classroom. The 12-year-old from Beaufort took to the water as if he were born for it. He worked as a stevedore on the docks, loading and unloading ships. He learned knots, ropes, and the names of every part of a vessel. He watched ships arrive and depart and memorized the patterns of the harbor. He became a rigger, climbing tall masts to fix sails and rigging. He worked as a sailmaker, cutting and sewing heavy canvas. He served as a lamplighter, keeping the docks lit through dark nights. With every job, Robert was learning. He stored knowledge in his mind, preparing for something he could not yet name. As he grew older, Robert became one of the most skilled maritime workers in Charleston. Ship captains and harbor masters knew him and trusted him. They saw his intelligence, discipline, and his natural talent. He mastered the complex waterways of Charleston Harbor, learning the sandbars, deep channels, and dangerous shallows. He understood tides, currents, shifting winds, and the signs of coming storms. He became an expert on the harbor, which would later become one of the most heavily defended places in the Confederacy. And he learned something even more important. He learned how to pilot a ship. In 1856, when Robert was 17, something happened that changed his life again. He fell in love. Her name was Hannah Jones, an enslaved woman who worked as a hotel maid in Charleston. We do not know exactly how they met, but we know Robert was drawn to her. Hannah was intelligent, strong, and quietly determined, much like Robert himself. They courted when they could, stealing moments together in a world that denied their humanity. On December 24, 1856, they were married. It was Christmas Eve, a day they would always remember. Their marriage had no legal value. In the eyes of the law, they were property, not people. They could not sign contracts or claim rights, including marriage. Their union existed only as long as their owners allowed it. But Robert and Hannah did not care about the law. They cared about each other. With permission, they moved into a small apartment in Charleston. It was tight and simple, but it was theirs. For the first time, Robert felt he had a home. Soon, their family grew. In 1858, Hannah gave birth to their daughter, Elizabeth. Holding his child, Robert felt a love so strong it scared him. Elizabeth was not free. She was born enslaved, just like her parents. She could be sold at any moment, separated from them forever. The thought broke him. Robert could endure his own bondage, but he could not accept it for his child. He began saving money. Enslaved workers were sometimes allowed to keep small amounts they earned from extra labor. Robert worked longer hours, took unwanted jobs, and saved every coin. When he had $100, he approached Hannah's owner and asked to buy Hannah and Elizabeth's freedom. The owner listened and named his price, $800. At a time when the average worker earned about $300 a year, the price was crushing. Robert was short $700. At that pace, it would take decades. There was no guarantee Hannah and Elizabeth would not be sold before then. Robert felt trapped. He was respected and skilled, yet legally nothing more than property. The anger and frustration must have been unbearable, but Robert did not give up. He promised Hannah they would be free. He did not know how or when, but he swore he would find a way. In 1861, everything changed. Confederate guns fired on Fort Sumter, and the Civil War began. Robert watched as smoke filled the harbor, and the Confederate flag replaced the U.S. flag. For white Southerners, it was victory. For enslaved people, it was opportunity. Soon Union ships blockaded Charleston, sitting just 7 miles away, 7 miles between slavery and freedom. 7 miles protected by forts and guns. To most, it was impossible. To Robert Smalls it became a plan. In the fall of 1861, Robert was assigned to the CSS Planter, a sidewheel steamer used by the Confederate military. It carried weapons, laid mines, and transported supplies. Robert piloted the ship. The officers trusted him completely. They did not realize he was memorizing everything: signals, defenses, and mine locations. The Planter was commanded by Captain Charles Relier, known for his straw hat. The officers were white. The working crew were enslaved black men. The Confederacy depended on their labor, never imagining that labor would be used against them. Robert studied every detail of the ship and the harbor. He learned all the signals, especially Fort Sumter's 2 long whistles and 1 short. Slowly, his plan formed. He would steal the Planter, take his family and the others, and sail straight past Confederate guns to freedom. It was almost certainly deadly if it failed, but Robert Smalls was done waiting. He was ready to free himself. The first challenge was convincing the other enslaved crewmen to join him. He could not succeed alone. But even speaking of escape was dangerous, because one wrong word could mean death. If even one of them had reported Robert to the authorities, he would have been killed at once. Robert had to be careful. He had to choose wisely, to find the men he could truly trust, and to sense who was willing to risk everything for freedom. Shh. E spoke to them quietly, one at a time, during calm moments on the ship. In hushed voices, he shared his plan. He explained the dangers. He made it clear that death was a real possibility. And one by one, the men agreed. Every one of them had a family. Every one of them had a wife or children who could be sold away without warning. They all carried the same deep hunger for freedom that burned inside Robert Smalls. Only one crew member was left out of the plan. There was one man Robert did not trust, so he told him nothing. The rest of the crew promised to follow Robert wherever he led. The most difficult talk was with Hannah. Robert went back to their small apartment and asked his wife to sit with him. He told her everything. He explained that they would escape on the Planter, that they would sail past Confederate forts in the dead of night, and that they would either reach freedom or lose their lives trying. Hannah listened without speaking. When Robert finished, he asked her what she thought. He asked if she was willing to risk everything, to place their lives and their children's lives on a plan that seemed almost impossible. Hannah looked at him for a long time. She thought about Elizabeth, now 3 years old. She thought about their son, Robert Jr., born just a year earlier. She thought about the future waiting for them if they stayed in Charleston, the constant fear, the knowledge that their children would grow up enslaved. Then she spoke words Robert would never foe. "Our jet," she said. "It is a risk, my dear, but you and I and our little ones must be free. Where you die, I will die." With those words, the plan truly began. Robert now watched and waited for the right moment. He needed a night when all 3 white officers would leave the ship. This went against Confederate rules. Orders required at least 1 officer to stay aboard at all times. But Robert had noticed the officers often ignored this rule. They had homes in Charleston, warm beds, and families waiting for them. After long days, they did not want to sleep on a cramped ship surrounded by enslaved men. Captain Relier was especially careless. He often left the ship at night, trusting Robert and the crew to watch it until morning. Robert waited for a night when all 3 officers would go ashore together. On May 12, 1862, that night finally arrived. The Planter had just returned from a 2-week mission to James Island, where the crew had helped place artillery. Everyone was exhausted. The white officers wanted nothing more than to sleep at home. That afternoon, Captain Relier told Robert that he and the other officers would spend the night ashore. This clearly broke Confederate orders, but Relier was not worried. He trusted Robert completely. He had no idea he was giving Robert Smalls the chance of a lifetime. Before leaving, Relier gave Robert permission to allow the crew's families to visit the ship that evening. This small privilege was sometimes granted to keep enslaved workers calm. Robert thanked him and watched as the 3 officers walked down the gangplank and disappeared into the city. He would never see them again. Once the officers were gone, Robert gathered the crew. The moment they had talked about for months was finally here. Robert reviewed the plan one last time. The families would come aboard as visitors, but instead of leaving before curfew, they would hide on another steamer docked at the North Atlantic Wharf. Later, the Planter would pick them up, and together they would escape. Timing was everything. They needed to leave early enough to pass the forts before daylight. but late enough that the officers would not return. Robert set the departure time for 3 in the morning. As night fell over Charleston, the families arrived. Hannah came with Elizabeth and Robert Jr., carrying a small bundle. She appeared calm, but Robert saw fear in her eyes. She knew what they were about to attempt. She knew that by sunrise they would be either free or dead. The other families arrived too. 4 women in total, including Hannah. 3 other men, likely relatives or friends, and several children who believed they were simply visiting their fathers. Robert gathered everyone together and explained the plan one last time. For some of the women, this was the first time hearing the full truth. They now understood they would sail past Fort Sumter, the strongest Confederate fortress. They now realized that if even one guard became suspicious, the ship would be destroyed in seconds. There were tears, there were whispered prayers, but no one refused. Every person was willing to risk death for freedom. Around midnight, 3 crewmen pretended to escort the families home. Instead, they moved through the dark streets and reached the North Atlantic Wharf. A small steamer called the ETA was docked there. The families quietly climbed aboard and hid, waiting for the planter. The hours passed slowly. Every sound felt dangerous. Every step on the wharf could have been a patrol. The children were held close, their voices muffled. Hannah pressed Elizabeth and Robert Jr. against her, praying this would not be the last time she held them. Back on the planter, Robert made final preparations. The boilers needed time to build steam, but starting too early would raise smoke and draw attention. Everything had to be perfect. As 3 a.m. approached, Robert gave the order to start the engines. Slowly and quietly, coal was shoveled into the furnaces. Smoke rose from the stack, but the night hid it well. Robert entered the pilot house and put on Captain Relia's uniform coat and straw hat. He studied his reflection. In the darkness, he could pass for the captain. He knew Relia's posture, his habits, the way he crossed his arms while watching the harbor. Robert had studied him for months. At about 3 a.m. on May 13, 1862, Robert Smalls took control of the CSS Planter and began the boldest escape in American slavery. He eased the ship away from the wharf, careful not to make noise. The engine pulsed beneath his feet. The paddle wheels turned, cutting through the dark water. Robert backed the ship into the channel, then turned toward the open sea. As he passed Confederate headquarters, where General Ripley slept, Robert held his breath. No lights appeared, no alarm sounded. He continued on. The first stop was the North Atlantic Wharf. Robert brought the planter alongside the ETA. Shadowy figures crossed between the ships. Hannah stepped forward carrying Robert Jr., with Elizabeth holding her skirt. Within minutes, everyone was aboard, 16 souls in all, 9 men, 5 women, and 3 children, all risking their lives on Robert Smalls. Robert checked his watch. It was 3:25 a.m. They were behind schedule. Dawn was coming. He pushed the engine to full speed. Ahead were 5 Confederate checkpoints, 5 chances to fail. The first was Fort Johnson. Robert gave the signal. 2 long blasts, 1 short. Seconds passed. Then the guards waved them through. Castle Pinckney came next. Signal given. Passed. Fort Ripley followed. Again success. Then came Fort Sumter, the greatest danger. At 4:15 a.m., the planter approached the massive fort. Robert blew the signal. He crossed his arms just like Captain Relia. In the shadows, he looked exactly like the white captain. The guards saw nothing unusual. The planter passed through. Behind him, quiet celebration began, but Robert stayed focused. They were not safe yet. He aced toward the Union fleet. As dawn approached, the alarm sounded at Fort Sumter, but it was too late. The planter was out of range, but now Union guns faced him. Robert ordered the Confederate flags lowered and a white bedsheet raised. The USS Onward prepared to fire, cannons aimed directly at the planter. Robert held course. Minutes felt endless. Then the sun rose. Union officers saw black men, women, and children on deck. They held fire. The planter pulled alongside the Onward, and Robert Smalls stepped out of the pilot house. He was still wearing Captain Relia's straw hat and the uniform coat, but now his face could be seen clearly. He was a young black man, only 23 years old, and he had just done something no one had ever done before. He had taken a Confederate warship and sailed it straight into freedom. Robert looked up at Lieutenant Nichols, who stared back at him in total shock. Then Robert Smalls spoke words that newspapers across the nation would soon print, words that would make him famous, words that captured the boldness and victory of what he had achieved. He said, "Good morning, sir. I have brought you some of the old United States guns, sir, that were meant for Fort Sumter, sir." Lieutenant Nichols was stunned. He looked at the Confederate flags now lowered, at the white bedsheet flying from the mast, at the 16 black men, women, and children crowded on the deck of the planter. He saw the cannons mounted on the ship and the weapons and ammunition stored below. He looked at Robert Smalls, standing calm and steady, as if what he had done was completely natural. Nichols had spent months blockading Charleston Harbor, studying Confederate defenses and wondering how the Union could ever break through. Now a young enslaved man had handed him a Confederate ship, fully armed, along with priceless military knowledge. Nichols invited Robert aboard the USS Onward and listened as Robert explained everything. He spoke about the plan, the signals, and moving past the checkpoints in darkness. He explained wearing Captain Relaire's hat and coat, copying his posture, and fooling the guards at Fort Sumter. He described the mines hidden in the harbor, their exact locations burned into his memory. He spoke about Confederate forts, troop numbers, artillery placements, and defenses. Robert Smalls was more than an escaped slave. He was a treasure of military intelligence. He knew Charleston's defenses better than many Confederate officers, and he gave that information freely to the Union because he wanted the North to win, the Confederacy to fall, and slavery to end. Nichols sent the planter and a full report to his commander, Captain E.G. Parrott. Parrott was amazed. He counted the cannons and ammunition Robert had delivered. Along with the planter's guns were 4 heavy artillery pieces and hundreds of pounds of ammunition meant for Fort Sumter. Weapons intended to kill Union soldiers were now in Union hands. But the most valuable thing Robert delivered was himself. Everything was sent to Flag Officer Samuel Francis DuPont, commander of the South Atlantic Blockading Squadron. DuPont was an experienced naval officer who had seen courage and skill before, but nothing like this. He questioned Robert personally. Robert drew maps from memory, showing forts, batteries, safe channels, and mined waters. He described supply routes and troop movements with stunning accuracy. DuPont was deeply impressed. DuPont later wrote that Robert was superior to anyone who had entered Union lines, a rare and powerful compliment from a white officer in 1862. The information Robert gave had immediate results. Just 1 week later, Union forces captured Coles Island without firing a shot. Confederate troops had fled, leaving equipment behind. The Union seized weapons and supplies because Robert had told them exactly how to approach safely. It was only the first of many ways Robert helped the Union war effort. News of the escape spread rapidly across the North. Newspapers praised the enslaved man who stole a Confederate ship. Harper's Weekly printed an image of Robert standing confidently at the helm. Robert Smalls became a national symbol, proof of what black Americans could achieve when given a chance. But Robert was not interested in fame. He cared about freedom, not just his own, but freedom for all enslaved people. He knew the war was about slavery, even when others refused to admit it. He believed the Union needed black soldiers to win. Enslaved men would fight fiercely for their freedom if given the chance. In August 1862, Robert traveled to Washington, D.C. He met officials and argued for allowing black men to serve in the Union Army. Frederick Douglass had argued the same, but Robert had proof. He had stolen a warship, delivered intelligence, and risked everything. Secretary of War Edwin Stanton listened closely. Robert spoke of millions enslaved and ready to fight. Stanton was convinced. Soon after, the Emancipation Proclamation allowed black soldiers to enlist. Thousands joined. By the war's end, nearly 180,000 black men served in the Union Army and many more in the Navy. Robert helped recruit them. Robert also wanted to serve himself. He became a civilian pilot for the Union Navy, guiding ships through dangerous waters. He later served aboard ironclads and fought in major battles, including a deadly assault on Fort Sumter. He was wounded but survived. Later, Robert returned to the planter, the very ship he had stolen. He became its captain, the first black man to command a U.S. military vessel. He led it into battle many times. Once, when a white officer tried to surrender under fire, Robert refused and saved the ship. He was rewarded with permanent command. After the war, Robert fought racism in the North and South. He organized protests against segregation and helped win early civil rights victories. He entered politics, helping write South Carolina's Constitution, serving in the state legislature, and later in the U.S. Congress. He faced hatred, false charges, and voter suppression, but never stopped fighting. Even as Jim Crow laws spread, Robert continued to serve his community. Robert Smalls died in 1915 at age 75 in the same house where he had once been enslaved, a house he later bought with prize money. He was buried with full military honors. Born a slave, he died a hero, a leader, and a symbol of courage. His story lives on because it shows what determination, intelligence, and bravery can achieve. Robert Smalls refused to accept bondage. He took his freedom and helped change history.